An Introduction to Constitutional Law, 100 plus Supreme Court cases everyone should know, by Randy Barnett and Josh Blackman. South Dakota versus Dole, 1987. The Constitution gives Congress the power, quote, to lay and collect taxes, duties, and imposts and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. This provision is often referred to as the spending clause, even though there is no explicit authority that allows Congress to spend money. Because this power is not expressly enumerated, a constitutional debate arose in the early days of our republic. What can Congress spend money on? Alexander Hamilton argued that Congress can spend money in a broad fashion in order to, quote, provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. In other words, the limit came from the text of the spending power itself. James Madison, however, took a narrower view. He argued that Congress could only spend money as necessary and proper to executing another enumerated power in Article 1, Section 8, such as the power to establish courts or post offices. The alternative, he thought, would undermine the enumerated power scheme on which our federalism is based. In United States v. Butler, in 1936, the Supreme Court adopted Hamilton's view that Congress had a very broad spending power. However, the Supreme Court also acknowledged Madison's federalism concerns. In particular, over the following decades, the justices imposed certain limits on Congress's power to attach strings to the money it gave to states. South Dakota versus Dole in 1987 illustrates one of these important limitations. The Supreme Court has held that Congress lacks the power to direct or commandeer states to take certain actions. For example, Congress can't force the South Dakota legislature to vote to raise its drinking age. That would be unconstitutional. But can Congress use its spending power to pay a state money to induce it to raise its drinking age? Or more precisely, can Congress take federal money away from a state that refuses to raise its drinking age? In 1984, Congress enacted a law that allowed the Secretary of Transportation, Elizabeth Dole, to withhold a percentage of federal highway funds from states that permit the sale of alcohol to people under the age of 21. South Dakota, which allowed 19-year-olds to purchase light beer, sued the Secretary. The state argued that because Congress could not force the state to raise its drinking age, Congress could not accomplish the same objective by taking away its federal funding. The majority opinion by Chief Justice Rehnquist rejected this argument. He wrote that, quote, the spending power is of course not unlimited, but is instead subject to 4 general restrictions. The first restriction is that, quote, the exercise of spending must be in pursuit of the general welfare. The court found that this first factor was satisfied because varied drinking ages created incentives for teens to drink and drive across state lines. Quote, the means Congress chose to address this dangerous situation were reasonably calculated to advance the general welfare. The second restriction is that Congress must condition funds unambiguously, so states know what they are getting into when they accept federal funds. In this case, the condition was clear and unambiguous. The third restriction is that the conditions must relate to the federal interest for which the spending program was established. Chief Justice Rehnquist found that, quote, the condition imposed by Congress is directly related to one of the main purposes for which highway funds are expended, safe interstate travel. The majority opinion did not define how closely related the condition must be to Congress's purpose. Justice O'Connor's dissent would provide a more constraining test for relatedness or germaneness that I'll come back to in a moment. Fourth, quote, other constitutional provisions may provide an independent bar to conditional grants of federal funds. The court held that the 21st Amendment, which allowed states to regulate alcohol, was not such a bar, and neither was the 10th Amendment. However, although Chief Justice Rehnquist listed 4 factors, he then recognized a 5th, very important limitation. A condition becomes unconstitutional when, quote, the financial inducement offered by Congress might be so coercive as to pass the point at which pressure turns into compulsion. And when compulsion exists, that would make the condition commandeering. In this case, however, South Dakota would only lose 5% of its federal highway funds. This incentive, the court held, was a relatively mild encouragement. Therefore, the condition was constitutional. Study guide. According to South Dakota versus Dole, are there any limits to Congress's power to place conditions on spending? Justice Sandra Day O'Connor authored a solo dissent. She agreed with the 4 limitations identified by the majority, but found that the third condition was violated because, quote, the establishment of a minimum drinking age of 21 is not sufficiently related to interstate highway construction to justify so conditioning funds appropriated for that purpose. She added that Congress cannot impose conditions, quote, because of an attenuated or tangential relationship to highway use or safety. For Justice O'Connor, raising the drinking age was not fairly related to the expenditure of highway funds. She explained that, quote, if the rule were otherwise, the Congress could effectively regulate almost any area of a state's social, political, or economic life on the theory that use of the interstate transportation system is somehow enhanced. The best way to understand what Justice O'Connor meant by germaneness is to distinguish between a spending requirement and a regulation. As she explained, quote, the difference turns on whether the requirement specifies in some way how the money should be spent, so that Congress's intent in making the grant will be effectuated. Of course, federal funding needs to be conditioned on those funds being spent on the particular projects being funded and not on something else. So federal highway funding can be conditioned on the money being spent on highways. That can also say how those highways are to be built. But according to Justice O'Connor, quote, Congress has no power under the spending clause to impose requirements on a grant that go beyond specifying how the money should be spent. Here, no federal money was being spent on establishing a 21-year-old drinking age. Instead, the threat to withhold highway funds was made to induce the South Dakota legislature to regulate its people in the way Congress desired, and which was outside of Congress's own enumerated powers. But the majority did not adopt Justice O'Connor's approach. So after Dole, the Supreme Court was solely concerned with whether the condition was coercive. It took the court 23 years to find that any condition on spending was coercive. That decision came in the 2012 Affordable Care Act case of NFIB versus Sebelius.